What would you have seen in Constantinople of the year 1000, during the so-called Golden Age of the heroic Emperor Basil II? Was Constantinople now shining in old glory again, like in the days of Constantine or of Justinian? Were the monuments of Constantinople rebuilt and now restored to old splendor? Were the old forums of Theodosius, Arcadius, and of Constantine now rebuilt, the old statues of antiquity refurbished, and the old city shone anew like a beacon of light amidst the darkness of the Middle Ages? Well, dear friends of late Roman history, we shall see in this video that the answer is more complicated than we would like. So how then did Constantinople look during the Golden Age of around the year 1000? By now, we have not only investigated how the city of Rome changed from its zenith in 320 AD to the utter desolation and ruin of the early Middle Ages some 300 years later, but we have also investigated how Constantinople changed during the course of its long urban history. From the early days when it was still a Greek colony, to the Roman Byzantium, to the fortified city of Septimius Severus, to Constantine's Nova Roma, to Justinian's Constantinople of around 540 AD, to the Constantinople of the early Middle Ages of 800 AD. In that last period, around 800 AD, we have found how surprisingly bad the state of the city was, and that many of the old monuments were already starting to decay, as discussed in this video here. But this is of course understandable, since after all, the 8th century was part of the Eastern Roman Dark Ages. Constantinople in these times had shrunk massively population-wise after the empire lost Egypt and the Levant, and was just generally under attack from all sides. Grain shipments from Egypt had ceased, and so the population began to shrink a lot, reaching a low point by around AD 750. Many of the old monuments of the city were no longer maintained, or if they could, they were chosen not to. Instead, they were used as a quarry for building material, every time an old building of the Grand Imperial past collapsed. This practice, called spolia, was really widespread, and we know it also very well from post-imperial Rome. But the empire in the following centuries stabilized, and now in the 10th century something absolutely remarkable happened. The Roman Empire saw a fascinating resurgence, something which many had deemed impossible by that time. During these years, the Emperor Basil II reigned over the Roman Empire, and under his rule, the Imperium grew again greatly in size. His rule was in fact the longest rule of any Roman emperor, even longer than the rule of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Augustus reigned for 41 years, whereas Basil II reigned for an incredible 49 years. So now that the empire saw its remarkable resurgence to old glories, how did Constantinople transform during those times? Well, one obvious transformation was of course the population of the city. The population peak of Constantinople was quite probably during the reign of Justinian, before the plague broke out in 541. The population estimates vary by which scholar you ask, but the excellent scholar Cyril Mango estimated the peak population between 400 and 600,000 people. By 750, that number had shrunk to below 100,000, possibly as low as 50,000. Thus, large areas of the city were abandoned. But in the resurgence of the empire, slowly starting after AD 800 and then really gaining momentum under Basil II, the city had now again reached population levels almost as high as during the days of Justinian. Thus, if you would travel to Constantinople of the year 1000, you would be quite impressed to see the streets again filled with people as in the olden days of the Roman Empire. The population in the year 1000 was probably again around 500,000, which represents a truly remarkable recovery. Okay then, but what about the city itself? How did the city look? If you believe some 3D reconstructions and 3D artists that recreate Constantinople, one might be inclined to believe that the city again looked as during the days of Justinian, that the old monuments that had largely lain in ruins in 800 AD were restored, that if you would walk along the Mese, the central street of Constantinople, that you would see the old Imperial Forums of Theodosius, Arcadius and Constantine in restored antique splendor, that you could visit the baths of Achilles and Zeuxippus like in the olden days, that you could marvel at the old classical temple of the Capitolium in the Philadelphion, that you could visit the Strategion and marvel at the central obelisk, that you could climb up the hill to the old Agora of Byzantium and see the restored old temples shining in new light. Well, friends of late Roman history, Constantinople was indeed great again in the year 1000, but in a very different form than many reconstructions would want to make us believe. And please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting our work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. And we have two new Kaisar members, namely Steven Papas and Georgi Kashev. Thank you so much, Steven and Georgi, for supporting this channel in such a generous way. This really helps me a lot with the channel, and I also want to thank each and every one that is supporting this channel in any form. I hope Maiorian would be proud. Gratias tibiago amici. So how then can we imagine Constantinople of the year 1000? Well, the city had by now transformed into what we would call a medieval city. The urban landscape of the city was by now quite different from the old imperial capital of the days of Constantine or of Justinian. Even during the days of Justinian, the city had already changed, and it looked certainly less pagan than during the days of Constantine. By the time of Justinian, the old temples on the Agora had already started to fall into ruin and were possibly reused for building material. That happened to many other pagan buildings. Every time one of those buildings collapsed, it was quarried for building material. During the reign of Basil II, repairs were carried out, yes, that is true, and new buildings were constructed. However, repairs were carried out only on the imperial palace of the emperor itself, on the hippodrome, because during those days it still served as a central meeting and assembly place, and on the many churches and monasteries of the city. The aqueducts were also repaired under Basil II, but only to fill up the cisterns for water supply. However, the old baths, fountains and nymphaea were never repaired. New buildings that were built were also quite different in architectural style as compared to the old imperial ones, and more akin to what many historians nowadays call Byzantine. But, and that is very important to understand, all new buildings that were built were either churches, monasteries, hospitals, or dwellings for the residents of the city. This can be reconstructed by building records of those times. Not one old imperial building was rebuilt apart from the aforementioned ones. The thermae of old, the old Roman baths of Zeuxippus, of Achilles or of Constantine, had been in disuse since the siege of 626, when the aqueducts of the city were cut. From that time onwards, the baths, as well as the many fountains of the city, were abandoned. The aqueducts were repaired in 768. However, the baths, the nymphaea, and other fountains were never repaired and fell into ruin, and were also quarried for building material. By the year 1000 thus, we would have found no trace anymore of the old baths of Zeuxippus or of the baths of Achilles. Similarly, the old Imperial Forums of the city had also started to fall into ruin as early as the 7th century AD. And already by 750, these forums were used as markets for cattle or livestock. And here too, instead of repairs and restorations, every time an old column or an old building from the time of Constantine or Justinian would collapse, it was immediately looted for building material. The only buildings that were kept in repair were logically, of course, churches or ecclesiastical buildings in general. Thus, by the year 1000, the city had since long started cannibalizing itself, very similar to what happened in Rome. Consequently, the urban landscape and architecture of the year 1000 was already very different from that of the year 540 and even more different from that of the year 330 when Constantinople was inaugurated. The city was now truly medieval in appearance, meaning that instead of a classical Greco-Roman appearance with many temples, columns, monumental arches, baths, amphitheaters, fountains and nymphaea, instead of such buildings, one would now see many churches, monasteries, hospitals, cemeteries, and dwellings of the population. Only the area around the imperial palace near the hippodrome would still remind of the grand imperial past. The palace itself was still kept in repair, as well as the Augustaion, the central square of the city. The column of Justinian was still standing, and of course the hippodrome. Here only, in the old core of the city, there was still the reminder that Constantinople was indeed the same capital of the Roman Empire that Constantine had chosen as his residence some 700 years earlier. But if you would walk through the Massive from west to east in the year 1000, you would find the old forums of Theodosius, of Arcadius, and of Constantine already in very bad shape, largely in ruins and used as markets. Cattle and other animals were drawn through the forums, and the Senate house in the Forum of Constantine had long been abandoned and most likely had also been looted for building material. The old temples on the Acropolis were by that time, of course, already fully gone, reused in some form in order to build new churches or in order to repair the imperial palace. Thus, we would not find a single temple standing anymore by that time. Not even the Capitolium was still standing during those days. It too had started to fall into ruin after the 7th century. And so its columns too were quite likely reused in some church or in the imperial palace or at the hippodrome. We thus see that even though Constantinople of the year 1000 indeed was glorious again, and had grown population-wise almost to its former size, the urban landscape, however, was very different. Instead of a Roman imperial capital of classic Greco-Roman appearance, we would now find a medieval city that would immediately be recognizable as very medieval. Except for the imperial palace, the Hagia Sophia, the Augustaion, and the hippodrome, all other buildings of the past were either in ruins or did not even exist anymore. Instead, Constantinople had been reborn in a different form as a medieval capital city that far outshone all the other capitals of Europe in those times. And if you are interested in how Constantinople looked around the year 800, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in Constantinople during the age of Constantine, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago amici, and bene valete.